Hi all. I hope you're having a good week. It's Tuesday, and I hope to have this up by the end of Tuesday or Wednesday morning so that you have a couple days to reflect on some of the things that I share about last week's class as a recap to some extent, and also some things that might be relevant leading up to Friday's class. So first, we are now 3 primary practices in. We've learned focused attention, body scan, open monitoring, and we'll get to other practices in time. But right now we've paused with these 3. And this is a time for you to reflect on the practices themselves. From our first week of class, where you received the cards on these 3 practices, you also received on the back of those cards the instructions for each of those practices. And so I would suggest to you that you'll serve yourself well if you are able to recite, without thinking too much about it, what are the primary instructions for each of the practices. This is helpful because they are in some ways similar, and in some ways they're different. And in some ways they will be helping us develop some of the very same capacities. And in other cases, they might be a little different in this regard. And so the more you understand the ways they're similar and the ways they're differences, both conceptually, because you know what the instructions for each are and you're able to very quickly say what they are, that will allow you to better understand the differences. It'll also allow you to, I think, have a deeper appreciation for the practice that you're doing as you're doing it. Also, at some point in time, as we began to play with this week, you'll be doing practices without listening to guidance. And so can you guide yourself through a focused attention practice, a body scan practice, an open monitoring practice, and know what you're doing? This is the time to really nail that down, and we can talk about that in class. Also, as it relates to the settling techniques, we're about to get into more settling techniques. We've been working with the relax, and in particular with the present moment pivot, with the slower, deeper breath, with triangle breathing, line breathing, box breathing. We'll learn some other breathing practices, and we'll also explore some other relaxation practices. Importantly, some of you, for example, have shared that the breathing practices really aren't your thing. For others of you, they're totally your thing. Well, we want to find some ways to relax, and there's a variety of methods for doing so. We'll be exploring more of them in time. We've also done a little bit of the observe, for example, drop the story, feel the energy. That's really an observe settling technique. It can also be relaxing, but it's primarily observe. And we'll get into affirm and we'll get into nurture in time. To know the distinction, though, between the 3 primary mindfulness practices that we've learned so far and the 2 settling techniques that we've begun to learn, or the types, that would be important to understand. And we'll talk about that on Friday when we get into the mindful living flow. We'll reconsider those. Now this week you're getting into chapter 5 on mindfulness. Chapter 1, leadership. Chapter 2, attention. Chapter 3, relaxation. Chapter 4, awareness, are all building blocks to the chapter on mindfulness. So I hope you find and have found this chapter reading to be informative and to help in some ways bring things together. Because we can talk about mindfulness in a big picture sense and the mindfulness practices in many different ways, we had a reading last week from this book. It wasn't assigned for this week, but you are encouraged, if you'd like, to look at those readings because they offer a slightly deeper look at mindfulness from a various wisdom tradition, the Buddhist tradition, to give you a little bit of that insight and the psychology of that tradition, which can be helpful and interesting. It also offers just another way of looking at the same practices as he talks about them in a way that's definitely overlapping, but will give you maybe some more ideas and ways of understanding the practices. Importantly, because some people might read this book and not have an app or not have other ways of listening to practices or talking about practicing, he also gives you some examples of the practices and says, practice this for 10 minutes or practice this for 5 minutes. And you don't need to do that. But you might find it helpful. He puts the practices in boxes to look through and go, oh yeah, that's a focused attention practice. Oh yeah, that's a body scan practice, and things like that, so that you can see that no matter what book you pick up about mindfulness, that's a good book, and you start reading about it, you see that there's similarities. We also in class had that reading from the Untethered Soul, the first chapter, The Voice Inside Your Head. And this is, as many of you noted, it's a book that actually can go pretty deep. That's why we're only reading chapter 1, because chapter 1 tends to be very accessible and very practical. And many of you noted, like, wow, I can totally relate to what he's talking about. Some of you said that you went out and bought the book, and I think you'll enjoy the book, but it really, in the first chapter, lays out what we're primarily focusing on, which is this idea that just like there are things in our midst that we can observe around us, we also have thoughts and feelings that are arising within us, and we can observe those too. And that's where his line that we spent a bit of time on in class, along the lines of, you're not the voice in your head, or you're not the thought, you are the one that notices it. And that was provocative in some way. Some of us were like, what do you mean I'm not the thought? I mean, it's my thought. And we don't have to, figure that one out. The idea, though, is, among other things, that we can observe the thoughts that are arising in our mind. And the reason that's important is because so often we don't observe the thoughts we're having. We just have them, and they can affect us. And we don't observe necessarily the feelings that are arising. We just have them. And there's a difference between being angry and noticing that you're experiencing anger. There's a difference between having the thought, I gotta have that, and being able to be aware that you have a thought, oh, I have this thought that I gotta have that. Those are very, very different. And so that reading is reminding us that thoughts are not facts, that thoughts will come and go, that thoughts will change, and that we can observe the activity of the mind. That's one of the primary lessons there. And all of the practices that we've been doing have been practices that in slightly different ways have us getting glimpses of the activity of our mind. Now, one of the readings for this week is from the wonderful book 10% Happier by Dan Harris, chapter 6, which you all will have read, and you'll be writing your own little chapter, 3 to 5 pages, of your experience with mindfulness thus far. I hope you enjoy the reading. I think you'll find that it further deepens your understanding of mindfulness. I think you'll enjoy the reading itself. I know that I thought the book was really terrific. And your writing about your experience so far in this class with mindfulness hopefully will help bring things together and be useful. So I hope it's a useful exercise. All right. A reminder, many of us in our small groups, and I've met with almost everyone so far, many of us in our small groups began to talk about the present moment pivot plus. This idea that when we do the present moment pivot and we get to our present moment pivot point and do our present moment pivot, that then as we begin walking, we continue to do the same present moment pivot again. For example, if you stopped and you did counting to 6 slowly, then you take 6 steps slowly, and then 6 steps slowly, and then walk a little faster. Or if you stopped and you did triangle breathing for 3, 3, and 3, then as you start walking, you inhale for the next 3 steps, you hold for the next 3 steps, and then you exhale for the next 3 steps, and then you continue on. So it's in motion the whole way through, but it's just bringing the very same present moment pivot practice that you were doing while standing into motion. And we'll talk more about that in class. So do, as a reminder, practice that. Bring that into your present moment pivot practice so that we can talk about mindfulness and in some ways cultivating a more relaxed state while we're in motion. You might imagine how that could be helpful in time when you're walking to court or you've just come out of a very intense meeting or other environments. Okay, lastly, on your practice journals, you've all done a nice job, and we'll talk about the ways that we note observations. In particular, how we can begin to distinguish where we're noting something that we've observed and where we are commenting on what we've observed, where we're analyzing or critiquing or elaborating on what we observed. And so we're really wanting to tease apart observation from an evaluation, say, or an assessment or an analysis or a narrative around our experience. Janine did a nice job with hers, so I'll use these as an example. These would be observations, very basic, descriptive observations, not a lot of storytelling or narrative or analysis around it. As I focused on my breath, thoughts came and went. I encountered some areas of tension. From the tingling in my fingertips to the warmth in my chest, I felt more connected and aware of myself. So what you're noticing is that Janine is making very basic observations about her experience, the activity of her mind, sensations in the body. Let's see if there was noticing I was hungry. And this is what we're shooting for. Now, importantly, whatever you've written is really important. It doesn't matter. It's not like it needs to be pure observation, because we'll learn a lot by looking at how we are not necessarily observing purely, but rather are adding on a story. Because during the day, as we're observing what's taking place around us, we're also adding on a story. We're analyzing, we're evaluating, we're judging, and that can be unhelpful at times. And we can, through even a practice as simple as doing a mindfulness practice, when we write our observations, we can begin to see how it is that we can clump together the thing that we actually are observing around us or within us with an evaluation of it. And this is a really nice time to begin to look at that, because as you look back over the content of what you wrote down, you'll perhaps begin to notice some patterns. And as Michael Singer talked about, and as other writers will be talking about, we can notice patterns in the way that we think, in the way that we process information, in the way that we experience things, and the feelings that emerge, and that can be really helpful to get to sort of know ourselves and get to know our patterns, not be as much influenced by them, because we see them more clearly. Some of them are very useful, some of them may not be so useful, and we can discern the difference. One last thing, some of you are starting each of your weekly journals with number 1. So please, if this is you, go back to the very beginning and make it cumulative. So every time you do a practice, make it another number. Right by about now, it should be in the 20s that you are. So you know that's how many times you've practiced. Now, if you on a particular day wrote didn't practice, you wouldn't put a number for that. So it's just putting a number to the practices that you're doing and keeping a cumulative record of it. And finally, the weather's been really nice, I've noticed. So this video is not the final word on this, but keep an eye out from an email from Madeline, where maybe on Friday we'll meet at the beginning of class downstairs on the bricks, and we'll find a place nearby to go to and do a little mindful movement practice, because it's nice to be outside with the trees when we're doing the tree. All right, looking forward to seeing you all on Friday. Hope all is well.